What would you do if you were thrown out into the winter at 18 with nothing but a small bag, a few coins, and the certainty that no one was coming to help you? Most people would have assumed the girl would not survive until spring. Yet by the time the fall finally arrived, the entire town of Red Willow Crossing would fall silent when they saw what she had built with her own hands out of a forgotten ruin. The door closed behind Clara Whitmore with a quiet sound that barely rose above the wind, but the meaning of it struck harder than a slammed gate. It was the sound of exile. Clara stood on the wooden porch of the farmhouse where she had lived her entire life, 18 years old, clutching a worn canvas satchel that held 2 dresses, a wool blanket that had belonged to her mother, a small Bible with faded pages, and 12 cents wrapped carefully in cloth. The January wind swept across the Kansas prairie like a blade, slipping through every seam in her coat and tugging loose strands of her brown hair across her face. Behind her, the yellow glow of the kitchen window flickered for a moment before going dark. Her stepmother, Eleanor Whitmore, had blown out the lamp as if even the light shining on Clara's back was more kindness than she deserved. Clara had known this moment was coming. Ever since her father, Thomas Whitmore, died the previous autumn after a wagon accident on the road to Ashfield, the house had changed. Eleanor had never wanted Clara there in the first place, and with Thomas gone, the thin layer of politeness vanished like frost under sunlight. The signs had been small at first, smaller food portions, harsher chores, long silences at the dinner table that pressed down like a weight. Then came the words, quiet and precise, spoken one cold morning as Eleanor folded her arms and told Clara that the farm now belonged to her alone and there was no room for an extra mouth. Clara had listened without arguing, because arguing would not have changed anything. By noon she was told to gather her things and leave. So she stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching against the frozen ground, and began walking down the narrow dirt lane that led away from the only home she had ever known. Snow began falling before she reached the end of the road, tiny white flakes carried sideways by the wind. Clara pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and kept walking toward the distant cluster of buildings that marked the small prairie settlement of Red Willow Crossing, for miles away across open land. By the time she reached town, her fingers were numb and frost clung to her eyelashes. Red Willow Crossing was little more than a scattering of wooden structures along a muddy road that winter had frozen into hard ridges. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and perhaps a dozen houses leaning slightly against the endless wind of the plains. Clara stepped into the general store where the smell of flour, tobacco, and kerosene filled the warm air. The owner, Martin Caldwell, a thin man with silver hair and round spectacles, looked up from his ledger as she approached the counter. Clara placed 6 cents carefully on the wood and bought the smallest loaf of bread he had. Then she asked, as steadily as she could, if anyone in town needed help. Washing, mending, cooking, anything. Caldwell studied her for a moment, the way a man might examine the sky before predicting a storm, and then slowly shook his head. Winter was the hardest time of year on the prairie. Most families were barely managing their own work, and there was no spare money for hiring extra hands. "You'd be better off writing to family somewhere else," he said gently. Clara thanked him and left with the bread wrapped in paper, though she knew there was no family to write to. Her mother's relatives lived somewhere far east in Ohio, people she had never met and had no way of reaching. She now had 6 cents left, a loaf of bread, and the prairie stretching endlessly in every direction. That afternoon, she walked along Cottonwood Creek, searching for anything that might offer shelter, a hollow under a rock ledge, an abandoned shed, even a fallen tree thick enough to block the wind. The land around the creek rolled in low hills covered with dead grass and patches of ice. Late in the day, she climbed one of the ridges and almost missed it entirely. Half hidden among weeds and drifting snow stood an old stone structure that looked like a forgotten tower. It was a pump house built years earlier when a group of farmers had tried to irrigate nearby fields from the creek. The project had failed after only a few seasons, and the machinery had been removed, leaving behind nothing but the building itself. The pump house was round, built from thick limestone blocks stacked carefully together, the walls nearly 2 feet thick. A wide doorway opened on the south side, and the roof above had partially collapsed, leaving wooden beams exposed to the sky. Most people would have seen only a ruin slowly being reclaimed by the prairie. Clara saw something else. She stepped through the doorway and felt the wind vanish instantly. The stone walls blocked the bitter air, creating a pocket of stillness that felt almost warm compared to the open plains outside. The interior smelled faintly of damp stone and old dust, but it was dry, solid, and strong. She looked up at the broken roof where the pale winter sky showed through the beams, then at the circular walls surrounding her like a fortress. The floor was packed earth with pieces of rusted metal from the old pump mechanism half buried near the center. Clara sat down on a flat stone and slowly ate the last of her bread while the daylight faded through the doorway. Somewhere outside, a crow called across the frozen fields. When she finished eating, she stood and ran her hand along the cold limestone wall, feeling the thickness of it, imagining what it might be like with a roof patched over the top and a fire burning inside. The thought formed quietly but firmly in her mind. If she could seal the roof and close the doorway against the wind, the stone might hold heat through the night. The pump house might not look like much, but it was stronger than any wooden shack and better than sleeping in the open prairie where the cold could kill before morning. Clara stepped outside as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature began falling rapidly again. She turned once more to look at the forgotten building on the hill above the creek. Snow drifted against its base and dry grass rattled along the stones in the wind, but the walls stood unmoving, as solid as the day they were built. In that moment, standing alone with nothing but 12 cents reduced to 6 and the stubborn will to keep going, Clara Whitmore made the decision that would change everything. The abandoned pump house would not remain abandoned any longer. It would become her home, and before the winter was over, the people of Red Willow Crossing would begin hearing the story of the girl who refused to freeze. Clara Whitmore began turning the abandoned pump house into a home the very next morning, because on the prairie hesitation could be as dangerous as the cold itself. The first problem was the roof. The thick limestone walls of the old irrigation pump house were strong enough to withstand decades of weather, but the wooden roof had partially collapsed, leaving a wide opening where snow and wind poured directly into the building. Without fixing that, the pump house would never be warm enough to live in. Clara spent the next day along Cottonwood Creek searching for materials. Using a small hatchet she'd borrowed from the blacksmith in exchange for sweeping his shop, she cut several young cedar trees and dragged the poles up the hill to the pump house. One by one, she laid them across the circular stone walls like the spokes of a wheel, letting them lean toward the center while leaving a small opening where smoke could escape. Over those poles, she wove thin willow branches together and covered the lattice with thick layers of dry prairie grass. Finally, she carried buckets of heavy clay mud from the creek bank and spread it across the grass until the entire roof was sealed against wind and rain. It was not beautiful work, but it was strong, and when she finished, the inside of the pump house was suddenly quiet and protected from the endless prairie wind. The doorway came next. The entrance was far too wide to keep heat inside, so Clara gathered flat stones from the creek bed and built a short wall across half of the opening, sealing the gaps with clay. A few days later, she traded some mending work for a heavy canvas tarp from a traveling trapper named Jonas Hale. She hung the canvas over the smaller doorway with a cedar pole and tied it tight with rawhide strips so it could be closed from inside. When the canvas dropped into place, the difference was immediate. The bitter wind no longer swept through the building, and for the first time the pump house truly felt like shelter. Clara then focused on heat. Near the center of the room, she found the rusted iron base where the old pump machinery had once stood. Instead of removing it, she surrounded it with flat stones and built a small fire pit. When she lit her first fire, something remarkable happened. The limestone walls slowly absorbed the heat and began radiating warmth back into the room even after the flames burned low. The stone held the warmth through the night, keeping the interior far warmer than the open prairie outside. Within days, Clara had arranged the simple space into a small but livable home. She built a raised sleeping platform from cedar branches to keep herself above the cold ground and covered it with her mother's blanket and a piece of canvas. A few flat stones stacked into the wall served as shelves for her belongings. Near the fire pit, she placed a flat rock that worked as a cooking surface where she could warm water or toast bread. It was not much, but it kept her alive. When March arrived and the snow began melting across the prairie, Clara started expanding her little homestead. She cleared a patch of land on the sunny slope below the pump house and planted potatoes and beans using seeds she earned by washing clothes for nearby farms. She built a small chicken coop against the outside wall using scrap boards and sod for insulation. By April, she had traded a week of fence mending for 3 hens, and before long the chickens began laying eggs, more than she could eat herself. She carried the extras to Martin Caldwell's store and traded them for flour, salt, and coffee. As spring turned into summer, the abandoned pump house slowly transformed into the center of a growing homestead. Clara dug a small root cellar into the hillside to store vegetables and stacked a neat pile of firewood beside the stone wall. She later built a simple pen and traded harvest work for 2 young dairy goats that gave milk each morning. With that milk, she began making soft cheese, just as her mother had once taught her. By midsummer, the change was impossible to ignore. What had once been an empty ruin on a hill above Cottonwood Creek was now surrounded by rows of vegetables, a chicken coop, a goat pen, and the quiet signs of a life carefully built from almost nothing. Travelers passing along the creek road began talking about the Whitmore girl who lived in the old pump house. Some said she was stubborn. Others said she was lucky she had survived the winter. But a few people, especially those who stepped inside and felt the steady warmth of the stone walls, began to understand that Clara Whitmore had done something far more remarkable. She had taken a forgotten building and turned it into the strongest home in the valley. And when the next winter storm came roaring across the plains, the people of Red Willow Crossing would discover just how important that little stone pump house had become. The true test of Clara Whitmore's strange little home came with the first great storm of the next winter. In mid-November, a brutal prairie blizzard rolled across the plains toward Red Willow Crossing, driven by screaming winds that pushed snow sideways through every crack and gap in the town's wooden houses. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and before the first night had passed, several families were already struggling to keep their homes warm. But the old pump house on the hill held steady. The thick limestone walls did not shake in the wind, and the heavy grass and clay roof pressed tighter under the weight of snow instead of loosening. Inside, Clara's small fire warmed the stone, and the stone slowly returned that heat, keeping the room safe and steady while the storm raged outside. On the second night, she heard fate shouting beyond the wind, and opened the canvas door to find a frightened family whose farmhouse roof had partly collapsed under the snow. Without hesitation, Clara pulled them inside, fed them hot stew, and wrapped the children in blankets near the warm wall. The next day, another traveler arrived with an elderly couple who had been forced to leave their sod house after the wind tore part of it open. Soon 8 people were crowded inside the pump house. Yet the warmth held, the stone walls storing heat from the fire and from the bodies gathered within them. For 3 days the blizzard raged across the prairie, burying roads and breaking fences. But inside the little stone building, everyone survived. When the storm finally passed, and the town stepped out into a silent white landscape, word quickly spread about what had happened on the hill above Cottonwood Creek. The same people who had once whispered about the girl living in a ruined pump house now spoke of her with quiet respect. They had seen barns collapse and roofs torn away, yet Clara's stone shelter had stood firm against the storm. By the time spring arrived again, the talk in Red Willow Crossing had changed completely. Martin Caldwell began selling Clara's goat cheese and eggs in his store. Farmers came to study the thick walls of the pump house to understand how it held heat so well, and travelers often stopped on the road just to look at the small homestead that had grown around it. The girl who had been sent away with nothing had built something stronger than anyone expected. Clara Whitmore kept living there for many years, tending her garden, her goats, and her chickens beside the quiet creek. And whenever winter winds swept across the prairie, the stone pump house still stood warm and steady on its hill, a silent reminder that sometimes the strongest homes are built not from wealth or comfort, but from courage and the stubborn will to keep going.